It's Long Waves Radio, today with my very special guest from Columbia University, the esteemed linguist, scholar, musician, and all-around good guy, Michael Shapiro. Stay with us. This is going to be a fun discussion. And I do have to tell you right at the beginning of the show that the opinions expressed on this show are solely my own and Dr. Shapiro's, and do not necessarily reflect the views of KYRS, its staff, management, or its underwriters. Michael Shapiro, welcome to Long Waves Radio.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here.
It's nice to have you in Spokane. Glad we brought up some good weather for you today.
Marvelous weather.
Indeed. So let's talk. You have been in higher ed in the U.S., the ed biz, as I like to call it, higher ed biz for 50 years?
Well, actually more, because my first full-time job was 1963.
Okay. And where was that?
That was at UCLA. I was an acting instructor.
Okay.
And then I abroad on a postdoctoral fellowship and came back and started in 1966 as an assistant professor at UCLA.
And there have been a lot of changes in the second half of the 20th century in universities. And some of that, I think, may have started in World War II with people like Vannevar Bush and their push to make universities technological centers.
Well, the GI Bill played a very significant role in that. So when soldiers came back from World War II, they were able to go to college. So I think that changed the complexion of the student population to a significant extent.
And then, of course, we had Sputnik in 1957. Right. So the entire U.S. establishment freaks out and decides that Russia's not only beating us in missiles, they're beating us in engineers. And they started pouring all of this money into...
And I was actually a beneficiary of that. The National Defense Foreign Language Fellowship was how I got to go to graduate school.
Because you speak Russian.
Yes, and so I had chosen Slavic languages and literatures as my major at UCLA, and then I went to Harvard on a fellowship, and that paid for my education.
So there was a few crumbs fell off the
table,
the tech table to the liberal arts, or at least language,
yes,
which is a good thing. But I think in a lot of the changes, especially the ones brought about by the military-industrial complex, to use Eisenhower's bon mot, a lot of the liberal arts and what we used to call the liberal arts and humanities fell to the wayside, became second-class citizens, red-haired stepchildren, if you will. Did you see that process?
Well, not when I started graduate school and when I started teaching. I think that we didn't see what was coming, at least not at UCLA, because it was, I think it was partly that there was a chancellor who was a medical doctor who created a lot of departments there after the war, and he was very keen on the arts and the sciences going together. And so the humanities didn't feel like stepchildren at that time. But in the last part of the 20th century, obviously, and now in the 21st, there's no doubt about it, and everybody's aware of it, that the humanities and liberal arts are there on sufferance, really. I think that's the way I would put it.
On sufferance. And what's the rationale that you see driving this change?
The change is that they're not revenue sports. It does not produce any revenue. And contrary to what people actually say after they graduate in the so-called STEM disciplines, the science, technology, engineering, and math, I was at a meeting not too long ago at Columbia where all kinds of alumni came back, people who were lawyers, engineers, doctors, and they spoke up and said that their liberal arts education at Columbia, where the first 2 years are compulsory. It's an old-fashioned curriculum called the core curriculum. And so they all went through the same liberal arts courses for 2 years. And these alumni, who are now in their 50s and 60s, came back and spoke very warmly about their experience and lamented the fact that the new graduates that they're hiring, for instance, in their law firm, cannot edit a brief properly. Like, language in particular is in the spotlight, that people don't have a good command of their own language and have to be helped along in even doing something like writing a brief. Not because of technical problems, just ordinary English.
And this is leading in the direction that I'm very much looking forward to getting into with. I recall back in the 70s, Johns Hopkins Medical School, the president said, or chancellor, whatever they call him there, said, we would rather have people with degrees in English apply to medicine because we can teach you the science you need to know.
Of course.
But we need people who can read, write, and think.
Yes.
And think. And that's the key bit. This emphasis on STEMs. Engineering is not engaged in the same kinds of thought processes as the liberal arts and humanities.
No.
So what's the difference here in your perspective? How would you frame that difference?
Well, when you're doing mathematics or physical sciences, you're learning how to do your trade in a prescribed way where there are rules about how to, for instance, derive theorems or draw necessary conclusions in mathematics. So you learn both a code and a method, which you apply over and over again, without saying it's necessarily mechanical. But it's prescribed, and there are ways of doing things where thought is involved, I think, in a secondary way. When there's a particular problem that you can't solve, obviously you have to think about how to solve it. But for the most part, I think that without it necessarily being easier, there are tried and true ways of doing your discipline. Whereas what you need in order to progress is the ability to think, as they say now, outside the box. And that can only be taught, I think, in a discursive subject, where language is used for thinking and developing one's thought and thinking more deeply and widely about whatever it is you're doing, which you can do when you get out of college, regardless of what it is you're doing.
Well, at the very beginning, the ars liberales were not the arts that set you free, but were the arts worthy and required of a free person to conduct his or her affairs.
Yeah.
So ethics, philosophy, an understanding of the geometry of the world, music, the trivium and the quadrivium, as later formulated by Boëtius,
right,
were all essential for the well-rounded person, simply to be able to conduct yourself appropriately. And that seems to be a bit that has fallen away from even the requirements of civic life. That somehow simply being able to walk and eat and drink and zip up one's fly is apparently sufficient training to be in the world.
Well, as a linguist, I would emphasize, I always look at what words mean. And since we have in English, if we're native speakers of English, we have the benefit of the Anglo-Norman invasion of English by Latin through French and so on. And if you look at the word education, what does it mean? It means leading out. Leading out of what? Ignorance. That's what to educate is to lead out of. Means out, and ducere means to lead.
Indeed.
So you're leading out of ignorance. And so education should do that. It should enlighten you by leading you out of your ignorant state into a state where you have knowledge and facts. And knowledge means, it has to mean facts, rock bottom facts, and then you have to apply logic. And where do you get logic? You get logic through discursive instruction that allows you to think. But without that bedrock of facts, you cannot think about any subject. And I think that's the advantage of the physical and natural sciences, that you have to assimilate a body of facts. You cannot be an engineer without knowing mathematics and principles of engineering.
And the properties of
and I think that has fed into this whole culture of the so-called STEM, that there you must arm yourselves with facts, which then enables you to obtain a livelihood and lead a life that where you can sustain a family and so on.
And that's the trap that gets so many people in, the idea that this must lead to a job. And I take your point that we're not leading out. I think perhaps a more appropriate word to describe what's happening is inculcare, which means to stamp in with the heel.
Right.
And
well, that's anti-American. We shouldn't inculcate because that sounds like propaganda.
It does sound like propaganda, so we have to wrap it in these sweet sounds about student-centered teaching. And, all of this assessment, and look at our numbers, we can show that students are learning. But, the test I really look for in students is not how they do on tests or how they do on forums, but how they speak, how they write, what they say. Yeah. That's all I need.
Right. But speaking about the liberal arts, again, looking at it etymologically, about word origins and how meanings accrue in a language, I think one of the reasons that the liberal arts are in desuetude, I'll use that phrase, even though it's not common, why they're being left behind, because liberal sounds like not liberating, which is the meaning that is intended, but at your liberty, which means whatever you say is fine, that anything goes. And that's what, of course, cannot be tolerated in a STEM discipline. You cannot have anything goes, because it's a prescribed way of, not that it never develops, it obviously develops and progresses, but you have a pathway that you have to follow. And so I think there is an opposition being set up subcutaneously in the minds of people that make decisions, that when you have liberal arts, there's too much liberalism, meaning ad libitum, whatever you want is fine. And that's not good for education because it doesn't lead you to anything.
Well, it sounds to me like you're almost describing this functionalist heart in the sciences,
right?
It's
which is good for them.
For them,
yes.
Indeed. But for the whole person, for the whole community,
right?
It puts us in the position of being ruled by technocrats, by technocratic language, with managerial systems of efficiencies, and we fall into that whole Taylorism.
Yeah, and going back to your example, Gary, about the Johns Hopkins medical school idea, which I think is not dead yet, the idea that what you should do in your undergraduate training, if that you can call it that, in preparation for medical school, is do the liberal arts, because medical school will give you the knowledge that you need. You don't need to be an organic chemist when you're an aspiring physician. And I think that idea that you need to be able to think, to minister to patients, doesn't only mean giving them injections and feeding them pills. And I think that medical people recognize that. But of course, they're caught up in a wave which is almost overwhelming to get as much training that will lead you to a smoother transition to medical school. But I think doctors themselves realize, and that's what I was had partly in mind about that meeting at Columbia that I attended, where you had alumni coming back and saying that we really can see how useful it was to us. And in fact, my cardiologist in New York is a Columbia alumnus, and he always tells me how much he loved the core curriculum, these obligatory courses that every undergraduate at Columbia has to take for 2 years. And there he is. He's sitting talking about his undergraduate education, not in terms of what went well in medical school, but what went well for him in life, how it prepared him. He's a man about 50 years old. So he's more than 20 years away from his undergraduate experience.
And it's still there, whereas virtually everything this doctor learned in medical school is now obsolete, outmoded, maybe some skills are still useful.
Well, he has to keep up, of course.
Of course, but with the liberal arts, it's
Yeah.
not so much keeping up as it is digging down.
That's right.
And
That's right.
and going deeper into it. And, maybe I need to go back to the pre-Socratics
Yes.
and see where this came from.
Right.
Which is a very different approach to understanding, and touches, I think, on a point you made earlier that I would like to return to, that language is essential for thought.
No, we're only capable in thinking in language. We're not we're primates, but we're not orangutans. We're human beings, and so we have this tool, if you want to call it that, which enables us to deal with our environment, communicate with each other. We don't have to use sign language or thump each other on the shoulder every time we have some meaning in mind. We have this marvelous instrument called language, and it's not limiting on it's enabling. So, but language is the means by which we manage our environment, ourselves, and the people that we communicate with.
And it seems that we have an almost infinite capability of formations of language, which has always struck me as one of the truly remarkable things about it, that with a limited vocabulary and a fairly limiting and prescriptive grammar structure, that nonetheless even children can create ex nihilo wonderful complex statements.
That's right. Yes.
that are new.
Yes. So that we use means that we inherit from the speech community, mainly from our parents, and then from the people around us. But we can innovate. Language allows us to innovate, and so that there's always some latitude for a new formation, let's say grammatically, a new way of saying something, nonce formations, that is, for the nonce, you utter something, which then takes off and becomes... And one thing that I would emphasize is what's called meaning by indirection, which is only something that human beings can do. That's, for instance, the ability to use tropes like metaphors and metonymies. No other animal can do it. And we are capable of saying one thing and meaning another.
And it being understood.
And that kind of power that language affords us is behind progress, that is innovation in how we manage our environment and technical progress. For instance, the word computer. Most people don't realize that in the beginning of the 20th century, computer meant only one thing. It was a person who computed.
And that generally meant secretaries behind adding
that's
machines.
Right, mostly females, but people who sat and computed things. There were no calculators, and or they were rudimentary. But here in 2015, nobody would think of computer as a human being sitting down and making computations on a piece of paper. So that encapsulates the idea that I have in mind, that language, to a certain extent, is binding on us because we can't constantly invent words, nonsense language that nobody understands. On the other hand, there's an inherent potential in every language, human language, for new formations, new ways of expressing ourselves. And the newness in language is always something that corresponds to some novelty in the reality that surrounds us. If we respond to new situations by dreaming up new ways of expressing, encapsulating or capturing the reality, but using an instrument where there are rules that you can't go beyond because you wouldn't be understood. It's no longer English. Let's say it's nonsense language or some kind of like Dada or trance language. Russians did that in poetry. So in poetry, many things go that wouldn't go. But again, that gives you a different domain in which to innovate. But innovation is at the heart of the way language is organized.
You mentioned that language reflects, in a sense, the physical
That's right.
existence that we have. Does it work the other way? Does then the physical existence that we have, does our language transform our sense?
Yes, definitely. And I think particularly in art and how we perceive art or the artistic, because I wouldn't want to limit it to representational art or even to abstract art, that language suggests ways of creating art objects. And since my main field is Slavic languages and Russian in particular, there is a history of modern experiments at the beginning of the 20th century, as the Russians were particularly good at this. And there were poets who were creating strange combinations that then influenced the perception of reality. So people began, in fact, it was programmatic with artists in Russia. They actually explicitly said that they wanted to change the way human beings perceived reality through art. And language, of course, is central to that, poetry. But not only. So the representational art was a way, but it came always, I think, through thought. You have to, and since you can't think about anything except in language, there's always a level at which the linguistic reality has an influence on how you perceive the world.
I notice one of the things I talk about on this show a lot is the deformation, the deliberate deforming of language in the service of power, in the service of politics. And we see it in propaganda. We see it in the whole range of mendacious. It's not even communication. I'm not even sure what to call it, because it doesn't actually say anything. It seems to rather create a sort of fuzzy field that's pre-linguistic, non-linguistic, if that makes sense. Do you have any thoughts on this?
Well, the only thing I can suggest is that language is supple enough and has so much potential and power that you can abuse it for good or for ill. That's the thing. I mean, use it and abuse it both. And the abuse, of course, is usually intentional in order to bamboozle people. And of course, we in America have a long history of bamboozling each other, including snake oil and people trying to make us buy things that we don't need and all that. And the whole advertising enterprise is linguistic to a large extent. Of course, it's pictorial. There's especially with television and so on there. But why are there so many people who do nothing but dream up advertising slogans? That slogan, think small. That was the guy that died recently who thought up that one phrase, think small, for, I think it was Volkswagen, which happened to be my first car when I was a young man.
But why are there so many people doing advertising? Because it works. And there's so many people who will pay money, and a lot of money, to get you to stick to a brand, to change a brand, to try something that you might not really be sure you're ready to try, to get you to identify with a product or identify a product with you. So you're changing fundamental relationships, I think, between people in the world.
Yeah, well, that's what I meant by its effect on perception. That language is the avenue by which you perceive the world because you cognize it. That is, you don't, if you're a normal human being, absent pathologies in the brain and so on, the way in which you perceive yourself and other people and your environment is through language, because you ponder, you think, you ruminate. And that can then affect the way in which you organize your environment. So I think that's what you're getting at, really, that language has an effect on how we organize our lives and our environment.
And it also has an affective component, which is important not just in advertising, but in all language.
Yes. Affective meaning emotional.
Indeed.
That we have to especially feel good. And why not? Why shouldn't we feel good? We don't want to feel sad or despondent. And so language helps us because it's not just somatic. It's not just a matter of feeling good in a bodily sense. But language can induce states or stages in your thought, because you're thinking in language, which makes you feel happy. And I'm, just trivial examples like greeting each other. if someone says, hello, how are you, they could probably indicate that by the way their face is when you see them, when they're smiling, or their eyes may convey a meaning. But that word, the greeting, why do we greet each other? Why aren't we just silent? And of course, we shake hands in Western cultures, but saying something does have a somatic effect on us through thought. I would insist now, much more than I ever did before in my teaching and my writing, on the body-mind connection, and put body into that bond that we have in our brains, because we do have to think about our own bodies. We're always aware of our body, and that awareness then translates into thought about it, and thought is in language.
And yeah, I wonder if people haven't always, if there wasn't a long history of people, of course, being aware of the connection between the body and well-being, the body and thought, the body and relationship. And we lost it for a while. It seems like we retreated into rationalism. We retreated into what we know of ourselves, and sort of excluded the body, excluded feelings as having a place.
Yes, but that's come back now. There are lots of people, scholars included, who talk about bodies, and especially women, I think, are interested in that. With the rise of feminism, I think the body becomes more and more important, because we are physiologically and physically different. The biological sex determines our differences, our physically. And so I think that then has to factor into the way in which we think about ourselves. And I think that women scholars have contributed to the rise and prominence of the connection between mind and body.
Yeah, I would agree with you there. Even at a simple level, we've known for a while that children have to be held as infants,
yes,
or they don't thrive,
right.
And that if they're premature, they'll die.
Yes.
If they don't have that physical connection
Yes.
with other people. So it amazes me that for years somehow we managed to write this out, the affective component of language, except as the somatic component.
Yeah, well, I think you're right about the rise of rationalism, which starts in the Enlightenment, at least in late Middle Ages and Enlightenment, that the body was something to be shunned because it is inescapable, that we're somehow imprisoned in our body, and our body is a limiting factor. And I think that we've gotten over that in the late 20th century and the 21st. The body is no longer seen as an obstacle. I don't know if people will agree with me, but I think that it's more and more being incorporated into thinking about health, not just physiologically or medically, but even mental health has to include, for instance, the whole fitness industry, which of course is a cliche about a sound mind and a sound body. Mens sana in corpore sano, which is a Latin expression. But I think people forgot about that somehow because they want to privilege the mind. The mind is more important, especially with technology. I mean, thinking with your left leg is not going to get you very far technologically. So if you can forget about your left leg, of course, if it hurts, then you can't avoid thinking about it. But there's a healthy way of incorporating your somatic side with your mental side.
And how would one proceed? How do you proceed with this incorporation? You've spoken of music,
yes,
before, and it strikes me that maybe there's a connection here because the music seems to...
Well, I've actually given this a lot of thought, strangely enough, although it's not my field, but I think because medicine is so important to us, more than ever because of the rise of the internet and the fact that people are not healthy in more ways than one, I think that there's been a failure, at least in the United States, on the part of government to promote public health in the sense of advising people how to live healthy lives, or promoting policies that will give us a sound mind in a sound body. And there are just things that come to mind that would help and advance people's well-being, that would incorporate this idea of how the mind and the body cooperate to make a healthy human being.
That's an intriguing idea. I want to take just a little break here for a moment and tell anyone who just joined our show that you're listening to Long Waves Radio on KYRS with Gary Krug, and I'm here with Dr. Michael Shapiro from Columbia University, linguist, scholar, musician, all-around good guy, as I said at the top of the show. And we are having a discussion about language and academia and sort of where we are with all of these things. So you have mentioned a number of times the sociology of knowledge.
Yes.
And the idea that knowledge itself needs, the construction of knowledge itself needs to be studied, the
Yes.
way that people use it. And you mentioned Durkheim and Mauss, and I, of course, jump immedially to Bruno Latour, who's one of my
even
favorites.
Robert K. Merton, which may be more, the name may be more familiar to American listeners, was a famous sociologist, and Talcott Parsons and people that are associated with Harvard. The sociology of knowledge is a phrase that's not commonly used or known in America. And what it means simply is that all knowledge has some kind of social matrix, that it's not created in a vacuum, even in the physical sciences. Some things succeed and other things fail. Some ideas are propagated, which die. So there's an evolutionary component, and that evolution of knowledge depends on human beings, because we're the ones that propagate it, think it up in the first place, and then allow certain ideas to spread and other ideas to die. And I think more than ever, because of the technological revolution, the digital age and so on, we have to be careful not to forget that we are human beings involved in seeing how our ideas, how likely they are to survive, and trying to favor those ideas which will allow us to survive as a race, as a species. And that takes some monitoring. I think it takes some thought and monitoring. That brings us back to education, because the educative function of schools should, in the long run, in the 21st century, focus on leading people out of ignorance, going back to basics. And ignorance means an absence of knowledge, and that knowledge always has a matrix in the way human beings interact. And so we should combat the tendency to privilege certain ideas only because they're associated with certain people.
But that's precisely what we do as a culture.
Yes, unfortunately.
And
I'm going to go out on a limb and say that the Internet fosters this, that technology, the way we now experience it, I think, unfortunately, puts a premium on who it is that is expressing an idea, propagating it, buying, selling. English is the only language that I know, European language, in which the word buy can be used to mean accept. For instance, do you buy this? Buy into, there's no German or French or other European equivalent to that. And so this is a cultural datum, a piece of knowledge about how we Americans negotiate, transact our business, that is buying. I don't buy that. No other language has that expression. They have the verb to buy, but they don't use it for accepting somebody else's statement or idea or assertion.
Now you have to say believe or accept.
That's
or
right, but not buy.
Uh-uh.
And this is I don't know if anybody else has paid much attention to this, but I think that's something that we have to resist, because we cannot monetize everything, and not every idea is useful in that sense of whether it creates a profitable situation for a business. I think we have to guard against it, and sadly think that the internet, for all its utility and its revolutionary character, does promote buying and selling.
Well, that's certainly what it's become. That is certainly what is becoming apparent about the internet. Is the monetization of every aspect of everything you do, everything one does online. Every click, every mouse hover, every site one visits, all tracked, all reported back to various agencies, which then sell this on to corporations to direct their advertising precisely at you. And it's a sort of intrusiveness in the construction of a person as this series of actions.
Well, of course, I would call it, from my own point of view, a perversion, because it undermines our essential humanity or humanness and how we, which, of course, I studied philosophy as an undergraduate, and I've continued. I write about certain philosophical subjects in my own scholarship, and I think that we have to go back to Plato and Aristotle, who had ideas that never were superseded and should be more widely known, including the idea of happiness. And happiness is not necessarily buying some new product. It could be listening to a nice piece of music that you don't have to pay for, and maybe that the performer doesn't even get paid for doing. To make for a happy life in contemporary circumstances where you have millions of people transacting a business, that is the business of life, in a digital age, we cannot think only in terms of buying and selling. The commercialization of happiness, which of course is progressing, because with the growth of industries like the spa industry and all kinds of other things, or yoga, it's always tied to some commercial end. But we have to somehow pull back. And here is where I think that the government, that is people like the Surgeon General, we have no spokesman, no spokespeople to convince us that there may be ends in themselves, that they're not ends only because they produce an income. Of course, we have to feed ourselves and our families, but ultimately for good health and for a happy life, there may be things that we have to do only for themselves and not for any ulterior motives.
So now we're back to the liberal arts.
Yes, precisely.
It gives us the language that's outside the language of commerce.
That's right.
It's outside the language of power and doesn't exist for any purpose other than to be read and thought about.
Well, you could say power of persuasion, persuading your child, for instance, that you're rearing to do the right thing. I'm not saying that they're inclined necessarily from birth to do the wrong thing, but they have to be guided. Again, it's leading out. The whole idea of education, I think, should be applied to our lives, no matter at what stage we are and what we're doing. So it's always a way of overcoming ignorance. The exposure, for instance, to other ideas for their own sake. When you pick up a Dostoevsky novel, you don't read it in order to be able to take a test only. Maybe in college, like when people took my course on Dostoevsky at Brown, they had to take a test at the end, and so there was a utilitarian purpose involved. But that wasn't why I was teaching the course.
No, and that's not why most students were taking it.
No. Although maybe some very clever students thought, well, if I have a good grounding in Dostoevsky, I may be able to use it for power, to increase my power of persuasion, maybe, which can be monetized. If we persuade somebody to buy our product, I'm not trying to advocate something which stops people from having a livelihood. I know I come from a family of musicians, and I know how difficult it is to make a living for a musician. And so there's nothing, no school will teach you better than being a child of two musicians, how difficult it is to transact your life when people are not paying you and expecting you to perform for nothing, which happened to my parents, where everybody expected you to come and play your instrument for a party or something, or a musicale, and they were not going to pay you for it, but they did it because they wanted to play. That's why I say something to be done for its own sake and not for some ulterior motive or purpose. And I think here I would again say that nothing can make you more happy. I think this is me speaking and not something that I read. Nothing makes one more happy than making another person whom you love happy. Nothing can give you greater happiness than when your child is happy, and if you can contribute to that, or your parent, or your spouse. What could be more important than your child or your spouse or your parent being happy? And if you can contribute to that, whatever the means are, we can quibble about how you do that.
Well, you're using too the deep, the profound, the old sense of the word love.
Yes.
A word that has been cheapened and
perverted.
Perverted. And to some extent, I think even the concept that you're speaking about is alien to a lot of people. They certainly never encounter it in their upbringing, and they often don't encounter it in the institutions that the state and the society foster for them. So they never really get that idea of that kind of love. I think they suspect it's out there.
Well, I think that...
But it has to be demonstrated.
Yes, but I think it's in our own cultural context. And you can say, well, this was necessary to build America. If you think about pioneers who had to deal with unknown territory, weather that they've never seen before, and fighting wars and so on, the focus is always on the external reality that you have to combat, overcome, and so on. But here we are in the 21st century, and some people say the enemy is us. I wouldn't go that far because I don't think in those terms. But I think that we have to appreciate the power of ideas for their own sake. And I think that's where we are now in the 21st century in America. Everything has to be for some external purpose. And we have to draw back from that. And the only way to do it is through education. There's no other way. And of course it can be done in churches, in houses of worship, a preacher, a clergyman who gets up on Sunday and delivers a sermon to make you think in ways which are not necessarily for utilitarian ends.
But just to help you discover how to be a better person,
yes,
to set you on that path with that set of tools.
Right.
And that language.
Yes, the language again. Why a sermon? You know, sermo in Latin means to converse. A sermon is a conversation. I mean, if you take the Latin root of this. So it's talking. And this is our human power to talk to each other and the power of words to persuade. And again, you've got to, in order to be able to persuade someone to be good, because that's what all religions want to do, to some extent or other, is to make the adherents of that religion virtuous, which means persuading them that evil or bad behavior should be avoided, or
that sure punishment
yes,
awaits you if you
course,
don't.
Yeah, and of course I personally don't like the idea that, and this is just me speaking for myself, I think that it's counterproductive to only think in terms of punishment. That is, if you don't do good, if you do evil, you're going to be punished either on this earth or in some afterlife. That's why I harp on this idea for its own sake, that virtue is its own reward. You know, sounds like a platitude, but it's true.
Yeah, indeed.
For my money, I speak as an American. Where else, what other language says for my money, virtue is its own reward? You don't have that in German. I know German, French, Russian, even Japanese, which is one of my languages. There's no such phrase.
So why are we so obsessed with the coin?
We're obsessed because it's a way of managing modern life in a context in which there are many, many people, many desires, conflicts. How do you organize a society to function smoothly? Money, after all, was invented and it circulates in a way which is abstract, because a piece of paper that says $5 on it doesn't take $5 to produce. So it's nominal. And this whole idea of commerce, it's a way of transacting business in a large sense, business not just in commercial terms, but how do we negotiate our lives? And it makes it easier. Unless we're primitive people, we live on the land, we harvest our crops, and we have pigs or cows, and we're away. And there are religious sects that do that, obviously. But for the most part, we don't want that. We want to be able to do other things.
Well, there's a kind of reciprocity in the exchange.
Yes.
And reciprocity is such a key factor in so much of culture, appearing in religion, especially. I'll give the gods this goat, and they'll give me, a healthy child or whatever. The exchange of sacrifices, which we see it in various healing rituals, and really, even in the kind of bargaining that goes on in some forms of prayer.
Yes. Yes.
So, at the root of a lot of human relationships, we have that reciprocity and exchange. So money's just another way of abstracting it.
Yes.
And discussing it.
Yeah, I'm not arguing against the utility of money. Obviously, it's something that has a long history, and it didn't start with the beginning of time. Coins were not minted or paper bills printed when human beings were living in caves and so on. So it's a historical product of technology, of technological advancement. And it does make for a smoother operation of a society, obviously. But it seems to me that if I were a clergyman having to give a sermon, I would try to convince people that they should be good for its own sake. And that they then suggest how that can be accomplished without self-abnegation. We can't all be walking around looking like beggars and waiting for alms to be given to us by somebody who has the means to support us. So I understand that. But I think ultimately the idea that we have to transcend, and this, I think back to your earlier question about the mind-body relation, the idea that we have to transcend our body is probably not such a good one, because it has come to mean an under-representation of the influence of our body, of our somatic selves, in the process of being human. Not now, I think it's being reversed, but we have to remember that there is that somatic component of happiness, and if we're in pain, injured, and so on, we cannot aspire to some higher state. And of course, Eastern religions have this very much like Hinduism and Buddhism and so on, the idea of transcending our body. But I think that can be a negative influence on the way we live our lives as well.
Well, that transcendence, I think, is often misconstrued, especially by people who don't bother to read and dig in, as many don't, as a transcendence of the ego.
Yes.
Rather than the death of the ego and the transcendence of something else.
Well, I would call it management of the ego. In thinking in American terms, managing it.
So we have an ego HR somewhere.
Yeah, we have to manage our ego, especially when we're young, and especially males, I think, have a tendency to have inflated egos, and women have to put up with this.
No.
Yes, horrors. But the whole idea in Eastern religion where the ego has to be erased or somehow deflated or not managed, but simply eradicated, that is not going to fly in America. So for American culture, we cannot do that. Although there are obviously Eastern religions are attractive to many people in the United States and all over the world. But we can't all live like hermits, in the desert, feeding ourselves on on berries and I don't know.
Wild locusts.
Yes, locusts, right.
I think it was John the Baptist whose diet was honey and wild locust.
That's right, yes.
No, we can't, but it does seem, uniquely American that this focus on the identity of self to the sacrifice of a lot of relationships to people, to the greater whole, to the commonwealth. We commonly say we're such an individualistic culture.
Yeah, well, that's embedded in our history. The whole idea of individualism is a very American idea, although it comes from the Enlightenment, but still, we value it to be an individual, to be independent. Rugged individualism.
Mm-hmm.
Where do you find that? In America. That's an American idea, which I think is conditioned by our history, about the fact that we had to, if you take the United States as a place that had to be conquered, then who are the people that were going to conquer it? Rugged individualists.
Rugged individuals, but yet still all working on the same project. So, I'm not sure. This is still an idea, as the Germans would say, im Bau for me.
Mm-hmm.
Trying to construct how the Japanese and indeed much of the Asian countries, do so happily without the idea of the individual as outside of the culture.
Yes. Well, I think the communitarian idea had some currency in the United States, but it was suppressed. And so communitarianism is something that we don't talk about, and we don't have, maybe that's in some sense necessary in order to make progress technologically, that you cannot sacrifice private or individual interests for the community in order to make innovations. Innovations usually are associated with individuals who innovate. And so a whole society doesn't innovate. Someone thinks of a good idea, as for instance in the current context, if you think about technology, it's somebody who has a startup, an idea for what to do with the internet, and then it becomes communitarian only in the sense that everybody buys into it.
Mm-hmm.
And then it can be traced back to some individual idea by some individual human being. And if the society constrains you not to think in innovative ways, for instance, this is what's often brought up as a deficiency of Eastern cultures, that they don't allow individuals to flower. For instance, in China, the people always talk about Chinese education as not furthering creative thinking, because you have to think the way everybody else thinks. And in Japan, which I'm familiar with, that's a very serious obstacle to innovation, even though they do innovate. But they now are more and more, they recognize that the American way of doing things involves allowing people to be individuals and not necessarily in consonance with the culture, what cultural norms there are. You have to be able to and be allowed to break cultural norms, go against them, in order to innovate.
So is that part of the change that we see with the loss of the job for life in the corporate family?
Yes.
That whole, you see that as a part of this whole transition?
Yeah, but it has very bad sides too. For instance, I can give an example which everybody will understand. The traditional Japanese family involved keeping your parents in the same house with you. If you're the child, you have aged or infirm parents, you took care of them in your own house. Now, the modern way is warehousing old people. They're actually doing what we do, putting people in assisted living. You don't have... so that old cultural norm, that pattern is being broken up on the American model. Of course, you could say it's not just an American model, it's the way of doing business in the modern world, that you can't ask a young couple with children to take care of their aged parents because it's too burdensome to them.
Yeah, it's going to inhibit their track Wow, that's a wonderful place to, I don't want to end the discussion, but I think we have to at least put a coda here and end the show, because I do have to be out of here. You've been listening to Long Waves Radio on KYRS Medical Lake Spokane, your radio station. I've been talking today, having a delightful time with Dr. Michael Shapiro, esteemed linguist, recently of Columbia University, who's been visiting us here in town. And thank you so much.
Oh, thank you very much, Gary. It's been a pleasure.
It's been a real delight. You can email me, longwavesradio@kyrs.org. You can find me on Facebook, KYRS. Nope, messed that up. Find me on Facebook, Long Waves Radio, or you can find the show on YouTube, where the podcast will be. Just put Long Waves Radio in quotes. You'll go right there. Thank you again for listening, and I'll remind our listeners again, this is KYRS Medical Lake, Spokane, 88.1, 92.3 on your FM dial. Till next week, have a really great one. Bye-bye.